The bronze star sits in a shadow box above my desk. Every morning before I leave for the hospital, I look at it for exactly 3 seconds. Not out of pride. Out of reminder. A reminder that I survived things my father said would break me, and that the worst thing he ever did to me happened not in a war zone, but at a Christmas party in his own living room, in front of 200 people who were about to watch him destroy himself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Sarah Calloway. I was 29 when this happened. I'd just finished my second deployment as a Navy Nurse Corps officer, 14 months at a forward operating base in Djibouti, 8 months before that in Okinawa. I came home with commendations, a promotion to lieutenant, and a clarity about what mattered in life that you can only earn by holding someone's hand while they die far from home. What I also came home to was my father's disappointment. That part never changed. My father, Robert Calloway, built Calloway Capital from a single hedge fund office in Hartford, Connecticut, into a $2 billion asset management firm. He did it through 20-hour days, ruthless negotiation, and an absolute certainty that everything in the world could be measured by its market value. He applied that logic to everything: real estate, art, wine, and his children. My brother Marcus went to Wharton, joined the firm at 23, and became my father's right hand. My sister Diane married a cardiologist in Greenwich. And then there was me, the one who joined the Navy at 22 because I wanted to be a nurse and believed that service meant something. My father never said he was ashamed of me directly. He didn't have to. He said it through the way he'd pause before answering when someone at a dinner party asked what his youngest daughter did. The half-second delay where you could watch him decide how to frame it. "She's in the military," he'd finally say, in the same tone you'd use to say, "She went through a phase." When I met Daniel Mercer at a friend's wedding in the spring, everything changed. Not because he swept me off my feet, though he did, but because for the first time in my adult life, I was with someone who made me feel like who I was made complete sense. Daniel taught high school history in Bridgeport. He'd been doing it for 7 years. He coached the debate team. 3 of his former students had gone on to West Point. He drove a 10-year-old Civic and brought homemade lunches to school in a beat-up cooler, and every single one of his students called him Mr. Mercer with a tone that made it sound like a title of honor. He also happened to have won the Connecticut Teacher of the Year award 2 years running and had just been named a finalist for the National Education Association's top recognition. None of that impressed my father. Not even slightly. The first time Daniel came to dinner at my parents' house in Westport, my father asked him what his 5-year financial plan looked like. Daniel smiled and said his 5-year plan was to keep as many kids as possible from falling through the cracks. My father nodded slowly in the way he did when he'd already stopped listening. After Daniel left that night, my father found me in the kitchen and said very quietly, "He's a nice enough young man, Sarah. But you've seen the world. You've done something real. Don't shrink yourself to fit someone else's ceiling." I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with my father was like trying to negotiate with weather. Daniel and I got engaged in October. He proposed at a small park in Bridgeport, near the school, on a Tuesday evening after he'd finished tutoring a sophomore who was struggling in history. There were no photographers, no planned audiences. Just the 2 of us and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My mother was thrilled. She cried on the phone and said Daniel was the kind of man who would never leave a room worse than he found it. My father said congratulations and immediately pivoted to asking whether we'd thought about a prenuptial agreement. We decided to have the wedding in early spring. Small, meaningful, but before that came Christmas. My parents hosted the Calloway Capital holiday party every December at their home in Westport. It was a fixture in their world, 200 or so guests, partners, clients, colleagues, a few family members scattered through the crowd like context. My father moved through these events like a conductor. He knew every person's net worth, every business relationship, every leverage point. It was the one night of the year where his entire identity was on display, and he curated every detail with the precision of someone who understood that perception was the same as reality. I had never particularly enjoyed these parties, but this year, Daniel was coming as my fiancé, and I was wearing my dress uniform. I want to explain that decision because it mattered. I wore my dress uniform to the party because I had been asked to. A week before Christmas, I received a call from Mayor Gerald Holt's office. Mayor Holt was a retired Army colonel who had served 3 tours in Iraq before coming back to Bridgeport and running for office. He'd won in a landslide. He was also, as it turned out, a longtime client of my father's firm, which was the only reason he was on the guest list that evening. His office called to let me know, that the mayor was planning to present a small certificate of recognition to Connecticut veterans at a private gathering. My father's party was the venue, and my name had been suggested by someone in the Veterans Outreach Office. They asked if I would be comfortable being recognized in uniform. I said yes. Of course I said yes. My father, when I told him, said nothing for a moment. Then, "It's a Christmas party, Sarah, not a ceremony." "I know," I said. "It's 15 minutes. The mayor will present the recognition, and then I'll be just another guest." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't refusal either. I took it as consent. The night of the party, the house was exactly as I remembered from every December of my childhood: the smell of pine and catered food, the low hum of people performing their best versions of themselves, the clink of crystal, the particular light that comes from too many candles in a room with high ceilings. 212 guests, I found out later. My father had increased the count. Daniel wore a navy blazer and a tie I had given him for his birthday. He looked exactly like himself, which is to say honest, and a little underdressed by the room's standards, and completely unbothered by it. He held my hand when we walked in and said, quietly, "You look formidable." I smiled. That's the point. For the first hour, it was fine. We made our way through the room. Daniel was warm and genuine with everyone he met, which I watched my father observe from across the room with a complicated expression. Mayor Holt arrived at 7:15. He was a broad man in his early 60s, with a handshake that meant business and eyes that had seen things. He found me near the fireplace and shook my hand first, then Daniel's, and said to Daniel, "3 of my staff came up through Bridgeport Public Schools. Good teachers don't get enough credit in this country." Daniel said, "I'd argue they get exactly the right amount, it's just distributed very unevenly." The mayor laughed. Real laughter. The kind that surprised him. At 8 o'clock, my father gathered the room for his annual remarks. He did this every year: a toast, a few business highlights, gratitude for the partnerships in the room. I had heard versions of it my whole life. This year he added something new. He mentioned Mayor Holt's presence and said the mayor had asked to share a brief moment of recognition for a guest. He handed the floor over graciously, which cost him nothing because he assumed it would be brief. Mayor Holt spoke for 4 minutes. He talked about the nurse corps. He talked about forward operating bases and the people who kept soldiers alive, not with weapons but with training and steady hands, and the decision to go toward what everyone else was running from. He said my name clearly, and when I walked forward to receive the certificate, the room applauded. It wasn't thunderous. It was the polite, slightly confused applause of people who hadn't expected to feel something at a holiday party. But it was real. When I turned back to find my place in the room, I caught my father's expression. He was not applauding. He was watching me the way he watched financial reports that didn't confirm his thesis. I should have known then. I should have recognized the particular stillness that came over him when something threatened the shape of the evening he'd planned. But I didn't think he would do it. Not here. Not with 200 people in the room. 30 minutes later, I was standing near the bar talking to one of his partner's wives when my father appeared at my shoulder. He touched my elbow, the way he did when he wanted a private word that was not actually going to be private. "Sarah." His voice was measured, the voice he used in negotiations. "I need you to go upstairs and change." I turned to look at him. "Excuse me?" The recognition was lovely. "It's done. You're making people uncomfortable." I felt the room slow down around me. "Dad, You're wearing military decorations to a business party. It's a costume at this point." He said it just loudly enough. Not loud enough to make a scene. He was too skilled for that. Just loud enough for the 4 or 5 people nearest us to hear. "I think you've made your point. Go change." "I'm not going to change," I said. My voice was steady. I surprised myself. His jaw tightened. "You are embarrassing this family. By wearing my uniform? By making a scene." He said it with such certainty, as if my refusing to disappear was the aggression. As if my standing there in what I had earned was the provocation. "Your brother has clients here. Your sister is here. This is my home, and you will not—" "Robert." Daniel's voice. Quiet, even. Direct. My father turned. Daniel had come to stand beside me. He wasn't tall, and he wasn't intimidating in any physical sense, but there was something in the way he stood, the same way I'd seen him stand in front of a classroom full of 16-year-olds, when something important needed to be said that made my father pause. "I'd like you to stop," Daniel said. My father looked at him for a long moment, the look he reserved for people he considered beneath engagement. "I'm speaking to my daughter." "I know, I'm asking you to stop." What happened next, I have replayed it more times than I can count. My father reached out and took my arm at the elbow, not hard, but firmly, the way you'd physically redirect someone, and said, "Upstairs. Now." And Daniel stepped between us. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't theatrical. He simply moved his body between my father's hand and my arm, and my father, who was not accustomed to being physically blocked by anyone, reacted. His hand came up, open-palmed, fast. He didn't hit Daniel. He hit me, across the left side of my face. Not hard enough to knock me back. Hard enough to make the room go absolutely silent. I remember the sound more than the sensation. The flat report of it in a quiet room. And then 212 people doing the same thing at the same time, which was nothing. Complete stillness. The kind that only happens when a room full of people is simultaneously trying to understand what they just witnessed. Daniel took my father's wrist. Both hands. Calm. Complete. He didn't twist it, didn't pull, just held it, and looked my father in the eye, and said nothing. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, a chair moved. Mayor Gerald Holt stood up. He was not in uniform, he was a civilian now, in a dark suit, but something about the way he rose from that chair made it look like a military movement. Deliberate. Intentional. He walked toward us through the parted crowd with the unhurried pace of someone who had made harder decisions in worse conditions and did not feel the need to perform urgency. He stopped 3 feet from my father. He looked at him for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room, "You just struck an officer of the United States Navy." 7 words. And then the 8th? Twice. The second word wasn't a word. It was a period. It was a full stop. Because the room understood all at once what Mayor Holt meant. Once when my father had taken my arm, once when he had hit me, and the double meaning that my father had done it twice, literally, and that he had struck someone with a bronze star, with a commission, with the weight of service behind her, landed on 200 people at the same moment, like a stone dropped into still water. I watched my father's face change. I had seen my father lose negotiations before. I had seen him receive bad news about funds, about market positions, about things he could not control. I had never seen his face do what it did in that moment, which was to understand, without any possibility of revision, that something had just ended. 3 of his partner's wives turned away first. Then a client near the window set his drink down and said something quietly to his wife. Then, in the back of the room, near the hallway, a young man in a dark suit stood up from where he'd been sitting on the stairs. I didn't recognize him at first. And then I did. Marcus Webb. One of Daniel's former debate students. I'd heard Daniel mention him, bright kid, Bridgeport. Full scholarship to UConn. Now finishing his first year at officer candidate school. He was home for the holidays and had come with his father, who was one of my father's lower-tier clients. He was 23 years old. He was wearing his OCS cover. He walked to the front of the room and stood beside Mayor Holt. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, in uniform, next to the mayor, looking at my father. And then my mother, who had been standing near the kitchen doorway this whole time, who had not moved, who I had watched with a weight in my chest because I knew what it cost her to stand still, walked across the room and stood beside me. She took my hand. She didn't look at my father. She looked at me. That was the moment I came apart. Just slightly, the way you do when you've been holding something very tightly, and someone touches your hand and says without words that you can put it down now. The party ended. Not in a dramatic exodus, people moved quietly, collected their coats, said subdued goodnights. My father stood in the center of his living room and watched 200 people find reasons to leave, one by one, until the room was empty of everyone except family and Mayor Holt and Marcus, who stayed because the mayor asked him to. My father tried to speak twice. Mayor Holt, who had seen harder rooms than this one, let him start each time and then simply waited until the words ran out, which they did, quickly, because there wasn't a sentence my father could build that would hold the weight he needed it to. Daniel kept my hand the entire time. The weeks that followed were not simple. My father called me twice in January. The first call was strategic. Almost an argument about optics and misunderstanding and how things had looked worse than they were. I let him finish. I said, "Dad, you hit me." And then I waited. The silence on the line was the longest I'd ever heard from him. The second call was different. It was shorter. His voice was smaller in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child. And he'd made a mistake and didn't have the vocabulary for what came after. He said my name. He said he didn't know when he had started believing that how things looked was more important than what they were. He said he thought he had built something, and he was starting to understand that what he'd built was a performance. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I think he knew that asking for it would have been just another transaction. He just said what he said and let it exist without trying to close the deal. I told him I heard him. I meant it. The story of that night moved as these things do now, through phones and inboxes and conversations. 3 of my father's partners requested formal reviews of their fund positions in January, not publicly citing the incident. But the timing said everything. His biggest institutional client, a pension fund out of Boston that had been with Calloway Capital for 11 years, sent a letter in February. Professional, measured, and final. My father's firm didn't collapse, but it contracted significantly. And the Hartford Business Journal ran a piece in March about shifts in leadership culture in regional financial firms that, while never naming names, was specific enough that everyone in his world understood exactly who they were reading about. My brother Marcus called me in February. He said, I stood there, I didn't do anything. And the guilt in his voice was so unperformed, so different from our family's usual register, that I said, Marcus, you stayed in the room. Some people left. It wasn't absolution and we both knew it, but it was somewhere to start. Daniel and I got married on a Saturday in April. Small church, 60 people, afternoon light through old stained glass. My mother sat in the front row and wept through the entire ceremony with the composed, dignified weeping of a woman who had waited a long time for something she wasn't sure would come. Mayor Holt attended and brought Marcus Webb, who had just received his commission and came in his ensign's uniform. When they walked in, the small congregation of people who knew the whole story understood the significance without a word being said. My father came late. He sat in the last row. He did not make a toast. He did not approach the front until nearly everyone had left. And then he walked up to where Daniel and I were standing near the altar. And he shook Daniel's hand for a long time without speaking. And then he looked at me in my dress uniform and he said, Your grandfather would have loved to see this. My grandfather had served in Vietnam. My father had never mentioned him in that context before. I don't know what moved in him to say it, but I know it was true, because I had a photo of my grandfather in his uniform in my shadow box at home, next to the bronze star, and I had looked at it every single day since I hung it there. I didn't cry until we were in the car. Daniel drove, and I looked out the window and let it happen, and he didn't say anything because he knew me well enough to understand that sometimes the thing you've been carrying for a long time gets heavier right before you're finally able to set it down. There is something I have thought about often in the year since that Christmas party. Not the slap, not the silence, not even Mayor Holt's 8 words, though I will hear those for the rest of my life. What I think about most is Marcus Webb, 23 years old, home for the holidays, sitting on the stairs in a suit at a party he had no particular stake in. Getting up, walking to the front of the room, standing there. Daniel had taught him for 2 years. He'd coached him through 3 debate tournaments. He'd written his college recommendation letter and his OCS character reference. He'd driven him to a scholarship interview when his car broke down. None of that was in the room that night in any visible form. It was invisible. The way the best things usually are. But when it mattered, when it counted in the specific, unrepeatable way that moments of moral clarity always count, Marcus Webb stood up. I asked Daniel once what he had taught his classes about courage. He thought about it for a while and then said, I always tell them that courage isn't the absence of hesitation. It's what you do with the hesitation, whether you let it stop you or just slow you down. Marcus had slowed down just long enough to make a choice. And then he walked to the front of the room. That's what I try to remember on the mornings I look at the shadow box. Not the weight of what I've carried, but the evidence of what good people do when they're given the chance. And I try to make sure I'm one of them.